So our next panel, our final panel, is going to be moderated by Kevin. Where are you? Hi, Kevin. By my colleague, trustee Kevin Guthrie, who's also the founding president of Ithaca, or probably a lot of you know of it as JSTOR. And Kevin will invite the panel. This last session brings on some of the themes that we've heard throughout the sessions this morning about how do we move from black box to glass box? How do we build trustworthy AI in education? So take it away, Kevin.
Thanks so much. So I'm honored to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. This is kind of a summary of today. So we're going to be very, very flexible. And one of the things that I want to say, one of the great things about being all here together is being all here together. And so I really want to encourage people just to raise your hand at any point. I mean, all of us are kind of ready for a dialogue. And that's more. Are ready for a dialogue. So please, I want to encourage people to raise your hand and just interact with us as we go through it. Everybody's ready for Q&A and engagement. So the folks we have up here on the panel today, Emma Brunskill is a computer science professor here at Stanford. And she creates AI systems that learn from samples to robustly make great decisions, especially in healthcare and education. Next is Maureen. Maureen Hymans is a VP and General Manager of Learning and Sustainability at Google. Next is Tony Chan, who's been in many different contexts. Was the president of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, King Abdullah's University of Science and Technology, and also a professor at UCLA. And last on our list is Matt Johnson, who is a researcher at ETS in assessment and AI. So we've got everything covered here. We've got a computer science professor, we've got somebody in industry at Google, we've got a president of a university, and we've got a researcher in assessment. So we're going to tackle it all in the broad way for the summary. So to kind of get started, I'll just tell a quick story myself. I've mentioned that I've been at JSTOR since 1995. And sort of over the years, I was an engineer by background. I kind of understood machine learning, and I understood how that worked, and we worked in that area, and we kept working on different things to make it work, and I kind of understood it. I understood how it worked and how you could put different inputs in and get different outputs, and you could judge that, but I never could kind of figure out how to make it into a product. Like, I couldn't figure out how to make it into something. I understood what it was, but how to use it was always really, really challenging. And then ChatGPT came along, and I had no idea how it worked, but I could figure out how to use it. It was so simple to use. It's so amazing that it's got an interface, whether that's the chatbot or the APIs or whatever it is, that anybody can use these things, but they don't really know what they're doing. They don't really know how they work. And so that's one of the themes. Our topic today is black box to glass box. Like, to what degree do these need to be transparent for us to be able to use them effectively, to be able to have the proper guardrails, to be able to deal with the equity issues? That's the broad theme that we're going to try to tackle. So I'm going to just have you all introduce yourselves with anything more you want to add, but then kind of address that question. To what degree is transparency important? What degree is that an issue? And how do you see it from each of your all's perspectives? Just go down the line. We'll start with you.
Okay. Yes, great. So delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation. As was mentioned, I'm a computer science professor. I focus a lot on AI and AI for education. I think this question of transparency is a really important one, but I would argue that often we're more focused on the trustworthy aspect compared to transparency, in that I think the reason we often want transparency is really an issue of trust. We want to be able to trust the things that we work with, and we want to trust who they're going to work for and who they might not work for. I often like to think about microwaves. I think many of us don't really understand how microwaves work, but we use them all the time, right? We can use them effectively, and I think we can do that with competence because we believe in the regulatory structures we have to try to make sure that we don't release products that are terrible for consumers, because of other parts of the stakeholder community that monitors for adverse effects that were unanticipated. And between those structures, that plus the sort of usability front allows us to use microwaves competently, even if we don't understand the physics. I think similarly, when we think about AI in education, which of course has a very long history, we don't necessarily have to understand exactly how a transformer works to be able to use ChatGPT. But we do want to understand what is the data that was used to create these models, where they might work well, where they might work poorly, and how we can understand how we use them and generalize them in order to have benefit for all.
So I'm Maureen. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this panel. And so yeah, what I do at Google is that, we already get a lot of students coming to us with their learning needs. And so what we try to do is use technology and AI to really improve and how they learn, make it more engaging, spark curiosity, make it more active and personalized, and so it can really drive learning outcomes. So it's been really an exciting last 3 years, I would say, in this space. And so how I think about transparency is, first, what's the motivation? The motivation is really because we want to improve those systems. We want experts, we want users of those models to really understand what's working, what's not working, so we can improve them. But we also want people, users of those systems, to really understand how they can best use them, understand what's the pitfalls. And so kind of thinking in two categories, right, of what we are doing to increase transparency, first with experts, like people in this room. And so what we have been doing at Google, for example, is like sharing our learnings, right? We've published a few tech reports on how we are improving our models. Like we have launched LearnLM, which is this model that is really built on learning principles. And from the ground up, it's not done as an afterthought. And so we really try to do that in partnership with experts. We have our own pedagogical experts in the team. Julia is here with me. And but we really did that as a partnership so that it's more transparent of what we do and how we really ground our models on those principles. And then we share back the learnings. We have done lots of efficacy studies, and that can show what's working, what's not working, what's the learning impact, and all of that. So I think that's the first thing about transparency, is to share the learnings, to share the principles that we use, and to do that in collaboration with experts. The other part is like, how do we make user of those products actually understand how they work, right? Whether this is teachers or students. And so that's where AI education is so important, right? To kind of explain what's working. Not everybody knows what hallucination is, right? So kind of making sure they understand those limitations. And then also, as you present, output, like response to question, make sure you show the sources of where it's coming from. So that's, for example, in search, it's so critical for us to link back to the source, to provide the citation. And so that can also enable people to check the sources and to understand how that response was generated from actual information.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to provide a little bit more background to what is written down there, to the extent of how it relates to ETS, Stanford, and AI, because those are the themes. So I'm on the advisory board of ETS Capital, a new member. Okay, and I really met Amit, I don't know where he is now, a few times in the last year or so. Amazing guy. He indeed is one of the best dressed people, whoever said that earlier. But of course, my connection to it is, of course, I took SAT, GRE, and even TOEFL. Many of you do not have to take that. So I know from that end of the assessment. Okay. Stanford, someone earlier today said she got lost. You were coming here. I got lost because my PhD in computer science was at Stanford. So I used to know the front of this building. But the back, this part is probably still old. But the other part, I actually walk in there, walk around, went back out. I said, it must be the wrong place. So I'm not really in the education field, even though I've been president of 2 universities for 15 years. So people say, you're a president of a university, you must be in education. But I know enough. The discipline of education is not what most presidents are trained at. So I know that. So I came here trying to learn something. I learned a lot this morning. Okay. So last part about AI. Before I became administrator, my research area was AI. My field was computer vision. So nobody used that term now. We would just use AI. So that's the connection. So whatever I would say, please keep those contexts in mind. So I want to come to the assessment part before I go to trustworthiness. So I'm reminded of a famous quote by Einstein. Right? How does it go? Not everything that can be counted counts. And you know the reverse. Not everything counts can be counted. Okay. Someone mentioned count earlier today in the panel. And that's very true, especially in the face of trying to assess AI. The AI will require a new kind of assessment. You all talk about this this morning. Now, coming to trustworthiness, my take on it is related to critical thinking, that was also mentioned earlier today. I watch YouTube a lot. And, today there's so many things that come out there. They're not transparent. You hear a famous person, speaking, you cannot tell whether it's that person speaking. The only way you can tell is if you listen to that person in different contexts. For example, interviewed by other people, so they cannot make that up as easily. And you tell, what this person is saying is just, in agreement with what I heard before. But imagine if you are completely uninitiated. YouTube, for example, they try to be a little bit transparent. They actually, at the end there, it's part of alphabet now, right, if I understand. So in the fine print, you will say something, it's like, you sign anything with long pages of fine print. But it took me a while. In fact, if you look at the comments, 99% of the comments just assume that it's the real thing. Assume, okay? So that's, to me, that's the key thing. Now, I want to make two general comments because I work in AI, okay? So one is people hear about AGI and general intelligence, right? The other one is artificial superintelligence, whatever that means. So I want to bring in Einstein again. The question is, Einstein, I think, is super intelligence, okay? So the question is, did all the stuff he did 100 years ago, based on the current big data, neural network sort of approach? I don't believe so. If you had given him the best data, the best ChatGPT in his days, so think about the thought experiment. Can he do what he did using that? I mean, I don't know the answer, okay, but it's a thought experiment. So I want to always keep that in mind when we're trying to extrapolate. Because I remember when I first used ChatGPT, because I sort of know enough to look under the hood. As I said, I used to work it. And I mean, super impressive, right? It can write much better than it knows a lot more than I do in sort of database. But I was asking this question. I think, there's a controversy as to whether we have AGI around the corner, whether it will replace all of us, including education and assessment. Well, that's what we do. So the jury is still out. I think that's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Matt Johnson. I'm Managing Director of Innovation Research at ETS. And as Kadria mentioned when she was up here on the panel, one of the major uses of AI in assessment is in the context of scoring. ETS has been doing that for about 20 years in the context of scoring essays. Back then, it was much simpler than the approaches taken today. But for the idea of transparency, what does that mean in the context of automated scoring? It means that we're giving the individual, the student, the test taker, information that they need, as Emma said, to decide whether or not they trust the score they're given. And that means to provide them with the technical details. How was their score arrived at? And this was true even before AI. When humans were doing the scoring, that was expected of testing companies. To say, how do you arrive at the score? And so if you look at old technical documents, they have very detailed descriptions of how a rubric was developed, how a set of human raters were trained to evaluate that rubric, how they were trained to come to agreement. What's a 3 versus a 4? What's a borderline case? Those details are provided to the test takers even before AI. So in the AI era, I don't think we should expect anything less. We should give individuals the information they need so that they can evaluate, do I trust this? And so just to give a little example, I was recently working on a chapter with some of my colleagues here in the room on this topic. And we said, well, what's out there? Well, if you look, not even that hard, and say, what tools are offered to teachers for scoring their students' work? Just do a Google search and say, there are many apps offered. And so I just kind of picked the top one that's listed there and said, can I figure out what this thing's actually doing to produce scores? It gave a very vague description of, we use your rubric and some prompts we crafted, and then we send it to a language model, and and then that's how we produce your score. I don't know about you, but I hope that that's not how my kids are scored in school. I'd like a little bit more detail on, maybe what's the prompt? How did you evaluate that? How did you decide that those scores you were getting back? So it's very important to kind of to provide those technical details and tell the individuals how was it evaluated. But I will say on an ETS example on kind of producing technical details in that way. E-Rater is an automated scoring technology that's used on some tests for some time. And, we provide all the details, that we think an individual will need. Well, a researcher at MIT, Les Perlman, took that information and he created a tool called the Babel generator, which just basically created nonsense essays that could essentially fool E-Rater. So there's also this, if you're too transparent, now you're opening yourself up for kind of adverse attacks, which is also something that, where to set that boundary between providing the information someone needs, but also protecting it so that, you can trust the results on the other end as well.
Yeah, so this notion, of the difference between AI and generative AI. I don't know if that's a binary change but there, it was talked about earlier, this notion of, skins or creating products around these LLM models. Do you need to know how people typically don't know how the LLM actually works. So how does that change the way you're thinking about this notion of transparency? If you don't really know that core of how it actually works, what is it you're having to expose? What is it you're having to show in your different domains in order for it to be trustworthy?
One thing we always been at the foundation of Google is evaluation and testing, going back to what Matt was saying. And so I think even more today with generative AI, having rigorous testing, whether this is adversarial testing. I just heard some example, in the context of bias of creating those scenario like that. There was one example of a tester teacher asking, hey, it was Diwali this weekend. Can you check whether my Indian student submitted the assessment, right? The assignment. And at first, the AI, which was cut by the testing, was like, sure, let me look at the names, right? And clearly, this is not something we want the AI to do. And so thanks to those testing, we were able, before the launch of Gemini into Classroom, we were actually able to kind of put more protection in place. So I think testing is really enabling us to be aware of those problems in the model. So I think that's the first step. And then evaluation. We do evaluation at different scale, whether this is efficacy study, which is, of course, the holy grail because it really shows you the learning outcomes, but it can take months. They have lots of variables. But then we also go to human evals where we leverage experts to kind of do evaluation of a system. And then you try to transform that into auto-eval, which can happen really quickly so you can get a quick feedback loop. But really investing in those testing, including adversarial testing, and evals at different scale in time, different signals that you can get, is how you are going to build trust in those systems. And I think with Gen AI, this is more important than ever because clearly they're harder to understand than the original system.
Yeah, and keeping the pace, right? It's evolving and changing so fast. Most of the efficacy studies take way longer than the half-life of these changes, right? And it sounds like what we're really testing are the outputs of it and seeing what the impact is and then trying to make back-end adjustments after that, right?
Yeah, and so those different type of evals I mentioned, you can also evaluate correlation. And so make sure that those auto evals that we are building are they properly, predicting learning outcomes. Not perfect, but at least you can do those correlation to try to improve them.
Tony, do you want to jump in, or Emma?
You too.
Go ahead, Tony.
You were asking about, most people do not know how these LLMs work, which is probably true. So human nature is such that there's a tendency to extrapolate optimistically, okay? You can call it a bubble, if you will. It's sort of irrational sometimes. Because, when I first read ChatGPT, as I said, it's so impressive that you think if it can do that, it can cure cancer tomorrow. Or it will earn me $1 billion if I invest now in Wall Street, right? So that's a very human nature kind of thing. But so I don't believe we are there yet because, as I said, there were many different opinions, even among the experts. Even for example, a few years ago, there were a Turing Award given to 3 people. This is a Nobel Prize in computer science. The 3 of them don't agree about this particular aspect. So I want to comment also on this, the output and the input and adjusting. I think you were mentioning that. I was thinking about that. So I took all the tests, right, managed by ETS. So the traditional view is you test the output of whatever the education system process is. But perhaps that's not the only approach or the right approach. Maybe you should determine first what the output should be. I'm a president of a university, so I know that's not how we do it. Where we leave the teaching to the professors. We don't say, right? So perhaps we should go the other way around as well. I'm saying, right? So you decide, for example, what should AI competence be? You have to define that, and it has to be beyond utility, jobs, and so on. It should be all these other aspects, ethical issues, philosophical issues, cultural issues. You decide on that, and then you design the education system that will hopefully lead to that outcome, and your assessment will be based on that. Right now, that's not how it works. Okay, I know because I'm sort of half a mathematician. We all test math. AI is the new math. You even think about it that way. Everybody should know enough about math, not because they want to be mathematicians, because math is so useful in everyday. In AI, for example, is super critical. So I think that's the way I think the assessment should be looked at that way, sort of going both ways.
I was going to see if anyone had anything further to add. So earlier, in one of the earlier sessions, Brian Brown was talking about this issue of how do we preserve cultural diversity and language diversity in the interactions. And so each of you have dealt with that in different ways. Can you kind of think about some examples where there have been problems or challenges or issues, how you may have addressed those? How do you feel about the ability of these technologies to be able to accommodate and anticipate and deal with these types of issues, the language and cultural diversity, and whether it's in assessment or in the work that you're doing on at Google or in research?
So I can start. So I think, one of the interesting things to think about is when we're using general purpose language models, I think Brian brought up this point as well, the how they were trained and what the kind of the optimization behind them is trying to do is produce language. And so it's going to produce language that's widely available in its training data. And so if you start to ask it to produce language that's in kind of small cultural corners of the universe, and then maybe ask that to, here's an example. We have a colleague who works on personalization, and in her case, it was asking an individual what their interests are. And then modifying a math question to kind of tailor it towards their interests. Well, what happens is, so that if that individual's culture or their interests are on the kind of in the smaller corner of the universe, and now you're asking it to create a math question around that as well, it's an extrapolation problem, basically. The language model hasn't seen that, so it's trying to extrapolate from what it has seen to produce something. And so, and a lot of times on the surface, it'll look great, but when you look at it in detail, you say, wait, for that culture, it doesn't make sense. That math problem doesn't make sense for that culture because the language model has no training data to kind of fine tune it in this small corner of the universe. So, that's a major issue when you talk about using AI to deal with kind of cultural variation.
I agree, but maybe so I completely agree with you. And as you start to get outside of sort of the data distribution, it can be a big problem. On the other hand, I think there are places where one should be optimistic. For example, it can be very good at translating things to different levels of reading level. So instead of us having to write things all at, say, fourth grade reading level, we know often in math software, unfortunately, some students struggle to do the math because they don't have the reading skills. But one of the wonderful things about generative AI is you can just tune that. Like you can just automatically adjust the reading level to maybe be 2 or 3 grade levels lower to be able to accommodate students that are far behind. Now, that's not a cultural issue, but it's an example of where maybe there aren't a lot of examples of, that level of math being, but it's something that could be transferred given the data sets.
So I've lived in at least 3 different cultural regions of the world. Most of my career in life is in US, Western. I grew up in British Hong Kong, so it's sort of half Chinese, half English. And I spent 6-7 years in the Islamic and Arabic world. Okay, so obviously very different history and culture. So language is one. Okay, I don't speak Arabic, so I can't really, but I speak some Chinese. And I have many friends who have that culture and language. So most of the database, right, in the LLMs are based on English. Naturally so, because even for me, okay. So one is there's that you can call bias, but just the limitation of the database, okay. But I think the cultural differences is even deeper. Let me give you 2 examples. I've talked about this. So the concept of privacy and the concept of freedom, we talk about that a lot. These are very cultural dependent and historical dependent. So privacy, we're talking at lunch today. We have people from different parts of the world. Okay, so in the US, of course, privacy is very important. Your home, where you live, right? You're very important. If you go to certain parts of Asia, you don't have that luxury. In Saudi Arabia, every home has a fence around it. There's a lot of land, very few people. You can do that. You cannot do that in Hong Kong or China or India. You cannot do that. So people are used to growing up sacrificing part of their privacy. So if your database has that cultural bias, if you will never get that right. That's a cultural dependency. Freedom is a loaded word. I think when we talk about it in the Western world, it's freedom of political freedom, speech freedom, and many other things, human rights. But in other parts of the world, it's definitely not the case. If you go to Africa, poor countries, economic freedom is the most important thing. Okay, if they don't have enough to eat, they don't worry about political freedom. Okay, sooner or later they may, but at that point they may not. So you also have freedom of safety, for example. Okay, I can tell you when I travel around the world, many people are afraid to come to the U.S. because there are many guns there. I may get attacked without, and now they read about certain federal agencies trying to do things. So I told them, no, that's not. But it sounds defensive, for that. But anyway, I point those things out because there is a cultural dependency on where you're from and how it affects how people look at these issues. So I don't think the LLMs or whatever are where we want to be today.
Well, I think that sort of wraps up. As I look down at Candace, I'll just say one thing. We all feel like these things are moving like crazy, super fast. We can't even keep up with them. And at the same time, I first met Candace 15 years ago. She was working on OLI. It was about adaptive learning. And it sounded like exactly the same conversation, right? So the more things change, the more they stay the same. Please join me in thanking our panelists.